Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of the Rosen Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chawla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by Brunella Rosa, CEO and Head of Research. As always, tons going on in the world, but really it's only one piece of news that's been keeping everyone awake at night, especially in the tech sector, the financial markets. It's the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. And more than just the collapse, it's what it brings, the return of financial stability concerns. It's a very complicated situation, so I'm going to dive right in, Brunello. Could you start us off by just giving us sort of the 30,000 feet view of the situation? What's the bird's eye view here? What's going on?
So what has happened in the last few days is that clearly financial instability came back to the fore. It seemed like revisiting the 2008 situation all over again, unfortunately. But perhaps, and at least hopefully, things would not necessarily need to go that way. Anyway, some things have gone in the wrong direction. In particular, a relatively unknown, but still important, 15th or 16th largest US bank by size, Silicon Valley Bank, went effectively bust. They had plenty of assets. They were not, in fact, a bank that it seemed to be on the verge of collapsing. They had at some point more than 200 billions of asset as of a couple of weeks ago, and a valuation of 44 billion less than 1 year and a half ago. And just to give you an idea, in terms of deposit, as of December 2022, SVB had almost 175 billions. So things didn't look like ropey at all, but then something has started to go wrong. About a week or so ago, there was a 42 billion withdrawal in one day after the bank lost 1.8 billion in sort of fire sale of his treasury holding of about 21 billions. In doing this sale, they lost that figure, so depositors got scared and withdrew, as I say, more than 40 billions in one day. So clearly the bank tried to arrange something to survive, a kind of a last desperate move to shore up its capital. They were issuing 1.25 billion of common stock plus other preferred shares that would accompany another share issuance agreed on a private market with a private equity company. Overall, we are talking about more or less 2 billion and just over that figure. That didn't go through, and therefore the bank had to go through the official procedure established by the FDIC that effectively took over and then established a new bank that would pay off the depositors. Clearly, people got scared of not seeing the deposits back because most of them were not insured. And as a result, the government had to step in and guarantee that all depositors would be paid back. So this is when kind of the situation stayed as effectively as of this Monday.
Last Monday. It seems like just because this happened, this only happened last Monday, and just in the sort of short time that's passed, we've seen a range of theories come up to really explain the failure and the collapse of SVB. And I want to bounce around some of these with you, but I mean, let's start off with what you think. Why did the bank fail?
So you're right. Time flew, and actually during the week, kind of SVB became a bit of an old story. And then Credit Suisse came to the fore, and clearly those things will continue developing in coming days. And now other smaller banks that are getting into trouble, Silvergate being one, and so on. The point is the following: the bank was not engaging in particularly exotic or esoteric even markets, as it happened during the global financial crisis, where banks were exposed to CDO squared, and all sorts of financial engineering products that were effectively impossible to value. And in fact, their value went to zero instantaneously as soon as the market dried up. These guys were actually having a relatively conservative approach. They were gathering deposits. Those deposits would come from the money that venture capitalists would give to startups. The startups get the money, they need to put it somewhere. They will put in Silicon Valley Bank, clearly way above the 250,000. We are talking in the million space, so not insured. Okay, so now you had lots of money in your deposits. What do you do with that? Well, you need to invest in it, because that's the job of the bank. How can you invest it? Well, that's always the difficult process. Banks are always in some form of speculative maturity transformation position, in the sense that they need to borrow at the short end and then invest at the longer end. What did they choose? They didn't choose anything particularly fancy. Actually, how can I say, the safest asset you can think of is the US Treasury. And we did some mortgage-backed securities, still US. Some foreign government bonds, slightly more risky. There's an exchange rate risk. There might be some residual credit risk, but here we are talking about very safe assets. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, it's not enough to have a safe deposit base and put in safe assets. You really need to make sure that you're a hedge against market risks. In particular, when interest rates go up, the cost of your deposit increases and the value of your assets decreases. And so you start being exposed to the most basic maturity mismatch. When your depositors want their money back and you try to sell those assets to give this money back, and the value of these assets is being reduced by the increase in interest rates, the money that you thought you had in your hands is not there anymore. And this is a problem. So in fact, there was a lack of very basic risk management practice there. I mean, the bank could have easily invested in floating rate notes, which somehow protect against increase in interest rates. They could have easily swapped their interest rate position, as almost every bank does, in order to be insured against potential increase in interest rates. But they didn't do that. So the bank really lacked in basic risk management practices. But where were the regulators? That would be the question. Because those things were easily visible. They were not, as I was saying, it's not like during the global financial crisis that you would really need to be a proper expert in financial engineering to understand what was going on in the bank's operations. Here is like, okay, who do you have as depositors? And you would see that about 98% of these deposits were not insured, and they were not sticky retail deposits, but rather volatile commercial deposits. And that their assets were mostly fixed income securities, which will lose value as interest rates go up. So a phone call would have been enough to alert these people that they were making some serious mistakes and they were exposing themselves too much to market risks. Clearly, that phone call did not happen. So here is where we are now.
I see. I mean, it really is a sort of telling story, an alarming one, because the cause of the bank crash wasn't some complicated reason we can't understand. It's actually very, very simple, and that's what makes it so alarming. And it also seems to be the case that SVB was in a particularly bad position because they kind of had the sort of depositors that are disproportionately more scared about their money because they're not insured, presumably, which wouldn't be the case with other banks, as perhaps they were less worried while holding the same, mortgage-backed securities and treasury bills. But I mean, why is this scary? What sort of consequences and risks does this pose beyond just SVB and beyond just the United States?
So the fact that it was called Silicon Valley Bank, the fact that some of the most important, say, crypto or digital asset companies out there had their deposit at the bank, including Circle, who had around $3.3 billion in deposits there. for, as you know, to guarantee the stability of its peg, of its stable coins, right? Immediately make people think, oh my goodness, these people were venturing some dodgy crypto game. No, as I said, it was super simple, super basic, almost, I would say, banking 101. But it's like these people have not read, I mean, like they read the risk management manual, page 1, and then they forgot to turn the page and see what was coming in page 2 and page 3. So what is scary is that these banks came into trouble for the most basic reason out there. Interest rates went up. So, and for macroeconomic reasons, there's nothing, this is not kind of market microstructure reasoning, a lack of liquidity in some complex products. No, the economy has evolved in a way, for reasons that we explained tons of times before, the interest rates needed to be increased. And that has exposed banks to the most basic risk out there, which is that they need to pay more for their borrowing activity. If you read my beloved Hyman-Minsky financial instability hypothesis, so effectively, the guy says, fragility develops in good times and then manifests itself with a financial instability episode when interest rates go up. That's the typical shock that Minsky speaks about. And you can think of others. So we had our pandemic shock. We had our war in Ukraine shock, right? So you can think of these as really exogenous shock that you might not have thought about. You might have said, oh, this is once in a century thing that cannot be predicted, and this and that. Okay, fair enough. But here we are talking about the real basic stuff. The economy overeats, inflation is too high, central bank needs to increase interest rates, and therefore fragile positions become vulnerable. And banks, according to the theory of Minsky, are the typical speculative, as I was saying before, position, because they borrow short end, invest at the long end, there's a maturity mismatch that they need to manage. So when interest rates go up, they are exposed. Very simple, very basic stuff has been studied in the 70s, in the 80s of last century. This is not rocket science, it's exactly how it is. It's just that people forgot that interest rates can go up because they've been low for so long. There's an entire generation of people that have never seen interest rates going up. There's an entire generation of people, maybe 2 at this point, that have never seen inflation in his own life. And they don't know how to deal with that. They don't know how to make valuations when inflation is high and when interest rates are increasing. So, and this is true for private sector participants as well as regulators. They seem to forget, oh, interest rates are going up. Let's make a series of phone calls and say, are you sure that you're, how can I say, resilient to that? Well, apparently in the Eurozone, this has been done, which is the reason why the ECB decided to carry on with this tightening cycle, considering its banking system to be more resilient than the US. We'll see. I finish by saying that the Fed was not totally unaware of that. Actually, we discussed so many times about the R-double-star paper in which the Fed says there's an interest rate above which financial instability episodes can emerge, the so-called R-double-star. And this R-double-star might be below R-star, so the natural interest rate or equilibrium interest rate. So this means that as the Fed goes towards the natural interest rate, the interest rate that it wants to be to reach kind of the equilibrium, reining inflation, keep the economy going, and so on and so forth, in this journey to increasing interest rate, it might hit a ceiling constituted by the R-double-star that tells you, be careful, because after this, you're going to have a financial instability episode, and you might need to stop your tightening cycle before you want it, for simply macroeconomic reasons. So The Fed was aware there's nothing really new under the sun, but when these things happen, it always hurts, it always hit the news, it always create panics, it always create contagion, it always creates spillovers. And as I was saying, other banks got into trouble. And then you had the Credit Suisse episode during the week that took over the news, of course, because it's so much bigger and more interconnected. But I'm really not surprised with what's going on.
Yeah, it occurs to me the sort of like Minsky idea you're speaking of is not there's a connection there to Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction, where clearly what's happened is terrible, and lots of people lost their money, and it shows the cracks that we have in the financial system and mismanagement by the bank. But what it also does is it weeds out the banks that are genuinely financially unstable, and we wouldn't find out which ones are if we were in sort of low almost zero interest rate times, which we have been for arguably far too long. But of course, you mentioned the Fed. The Fed's not done. It's a tightening cycle. It has the FOMC meeting next week, and it might raise rates again by 50 basis points. You say so. Possibly not the last financial instability episode of this quarter, but that's something we'll find out. But it's good that we really understand the basic logic that underpins these sort of things, and it's something we'll watch out for in the weeks and months to come. As always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.